Are the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran the same? It's a huge question, and one that sparks a ton of debate. Well, today, we're going to dig into an analysis that tackles this question head-on by looking at what the Bible and the Quran actually say about the very nature of God.
So yeah, that's the big question, right? Are Yahweh HWH and Allah just different names for the same being? Or are we talking about two completely different entities described in these holy books? To figure this out, the analysis we're exploring goes right to the source, the scriptures themselves.
All right, let's kick things off with the Bible. To build its case, the analysis first takes a close look at how the God of the Bible, YHW, is described, and it zeroes in on one characteristic in particular: truth. The first piece of the puzzle here comes from the New Testament book of Titus, and it's a super direct statement. It defines God not by what he can do, but by what he absolutely cannot do: lie.
And this isn't just a one-off idea, you know? The book of Hebrews really hammers this point home even more forcefully. The analysis uses these verses to argue that for the biblical God, being truthful isn't just a choice, it's baked into his very nature. It's who he is.
So the big takeaway here is that from a biblical point of view, God doesn't just tell the truth, he fundamentally is truth. And this idea, it's the bedrock for the whole comparison we're about to get into.
Now, let's switch gears and look at the Quran's description of Allah. And here, the source material zeroes in on a very different character trait, one that's a world away from what we just saw.
Okay, so before we jump into the verses themselves, we got to get our heads around one key Arabic word: makr. The analysis we're looking at defines this as meaning to plot, scheme, or deceive. You'll want to keep that definition tucked in your back pocket for what's coming next. All right, this verse from Surah 3 is pretty much the linchpin of the source's whole argument. It lays out a scene where people are scheming, and in response, Allah is scheming right back. But then it drops this bombshell of a statement that Allah is Khair al-Makirin, which the source translates as the best of schemers.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. The source points out that this word makr often gets a different paint job in translations depending on who's doing it. See, when humans do it, it's translated as plotting or deceiving. But when Allah does it, well, translators often dial it back, softening it to just planning. The analysis we're following argues this little switch-up kind of hides the real punch of the original word. And believe me, this isn't just a one-time thing. The analysis points to a bunch of other verses, like in Surah 4, where it says Allah is deceiving hypocrites. Then you've got Surahs 8 and 86, where he's again called the best of planners or schemers. So, according to the source, you're seeing a really consistent pattern emerge here. Okay, so now we get to the real showdown, where the analysis puts these two descriptions of God right next to each other.
And this is really the core conflict presented in the source material, laid out plain and simple. On one side, you've got a God who, by his very nature, finds it impossible to lie. And on the other side, you've got a God who is literally called the best of schemers. The source basically argues that these two descriptions, well, they just can't coexist. They're fundamentally incompatible.
And hey, the analysis doesn't just stop at truth versus scheming. It zooms out to look at other major ideas. Take relationships, for example. The Bible presents YSWH as a father, right? But the Quran presents Allah as a master. Or how about incarnation? The whole idea of God becoming a man in Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity, but in Islam, that's considered blasphemy or shirk. Salvation, it's grace versus works. And even knowability. Is God someone you could know personally, or is he ultimately unknowable? You see the contrast?
This all builds to what is probably the most jaw-dropping point in the entire analysis. It actually puts the titles for Allah from the Quran, like the greatest deceiver, side by side with the titles the Bible gives to Satan. You know, the father of lies, the deceiver of nations. And the conclusion the source draws from this is pretty stark, that the descriptions of Allah in the Quran are synonymous with how Satan is described in the Bible. So after laying out this comparison of God's nature, the analysis pivots and turns its attention to the prophet, Muhammad. It applies what it calls a litmus test that it finds inside the Quran itself, using it to take a look at his credibility.
So let's break this down. It's basically a three-step argument. Step 1, the Quran itself in Surah 69 says that if a prophet was fake, he'd die because his aorta was cut. Step 2, a hadith, which is a collection of Muhammad's sayings, actually quotes him on his deathbed, saying he felt like his aorta was being cut. So, step 3 is the inference the source makes, that by the Quran's own standard, Muhammad seems to have fulfilled the sign of a false prophet. And there's more. The analysis brings up a few other points to back this up, like the historical accounts of the so-called satanic verses. It also points to Quranic verses where Muhammad admits he doesn't know his own eternal fate and that he needs forgiveness for his own sins, and then it contrasts all of that with the biblical standard for what makes a true prophet.
So where does all of this leave us? How does it all tie together? Well, the final part of the analysis pulls all these different threads into one single conclusion.
Okay, let's do a quick recap of the entire argument. First, the source establishes the God of the Bible as a God who cannot lie. Then it presents the God of the Quran as the best of schemers. From there, it argues that these attributes given to Allah actually line up with the Bible's description of Satan. And finally, it uses a litmus test from Islamic texts themselves to question the Prophet Muhammad. So the bottom line, the final conclusion of this particular textual analysis is that YHW and Allah aren't just different names for the same being. They're presented as fundamentally and completely different.
And that really leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on, doesn't it? If you zoom out from this one specific comparison, it really makes you think about how any foundational text defines its biggest ideas, like what divinity is or what truth is. It's a great reminder to always look really closely at what a text is actually claiming, and then to take that next step and ask, okay, what are the logical consequences of those claims?